Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Stars Like Us. I am your host, Aliza Kelly, and it is a profound honor to welcome, I can't believe it, it's Dr. Richard Tarnas, who is here on our show. For those who are not yet familiar with Dr. Tarnas, I don't know what you're doing with your life yet, but here's the bio. Richard Tarnas is a professor of psychology and cultural history at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where he founded the graduate program in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. He teaches courses in the history of ideas, archetypal astrology, depth astrology, and religious evolution. He is the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, a history of the Western worldview, from the ancient Greek to the postmodern, that is widely used in universities, and Cosmos and Psyche, which received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network and is the basis for the documentary series, The Changing of the Gods. We also now know that Dr. Tarnas is a Pisces Sun, an Aries Moon, and a Gemini Rising. And at the time of this recording, we are just a few hours away from a beautiful mutable transit. We have a full moon in Virgo, sort of at the backdrop of this conversation. It is such an honor to have you on the show. I am such a huge fan of your work. For listeners who are not yet familiar with Dr. Tarnas, is absolutely an icon truly in astrology and astrological research. Mundane astrology, has done extraordinary research and it created this canonical work, which was really mapping huge epics in history through the lens of mundane astrology and massive, the outer planets, massive astrological movements that were taking place. And Cosmos and Psyche has been, especially in the past 2 years, I think it came on everyone's radar during the global pandemic, because that was definitely something that was discussed in the context of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So I'm absolutely a total fan. I cannot believe we have you on the show. It is such a blessing. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's very, very kind of you to welcome me to your audience, and appreciate the glowing review.
Well, it's from my Pisces moon heart. So it's real. So it really touches me that deeply.
Thank you.
So I would love to just, give our listeners sort of your introduction in your own words of what your journey with this material and this work has been. You have been working for many decades in this field. So if you wouldn't mind sharing sort of like your own origin story, I think that would be an amazing place to start.
Well, sure. I began with, like many who received a typical 20th century education, and I think probably the more rigorous the education, the more likely you were to have a negative view of astrology, if it even crossed your horizon. And it wasn't until I was at university, I was about 20 years old, and this was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a professor at the Harvard Divinity School. I was an undergraduate at Harvard College at this time, and a professor at the Divinity School who was also a Jungian analyst, and he'd been trained by C.G. Jung in Switzerland. This professor was from Switzerland, and we had become friends. Actually, he at one time had been the therapist for my girlfriend at Radcliffe. And so we're talking like 1970. So this is like the the early Jurassic period. So what are we talking about? 52 years ago. And we had our conversations about, European ideas and philosophy, psychology, Jung, Freud, things like that. And it was always a kind of elevated intellectual scholarly discussion. And then one day he must have asked me for my birth date, maybe birth information generally. I too had been born in Switzerland, in Geneva, so that might have been a common thread. But he said, he came into our conversation one day talking about where the positions of my planets were and what that could signify. And I thought he'd taken leave of his senses. I thought, geez, we're usually having this, very erudite scholarly discussion, and now we've descended to the pure world of fantasy and superstition. And I kind of steered the conversation back to our usual pathways. And in retrospect, I see how, I don't know how much we choose astrology so much as astrology chooses us. It knocks on the door. It enters our lives in different ways. And I wasn't apparently ready at that point. But a couple of years later, after I graduated, I was coming from the East Coast to the West Coast. I was coming to Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, which was at that time it still is a real center of adventurous learning, but at that point it was a kind of world center of the counterculture, of new ideas as well as ancient ideas, and it took seriously things like shamanism or astrology, or it brought in really excellent teachers like Dane Rudhyar came through there, for example, in the 60s and taught. So in fact, even there was even a birth chart for Esalen that was around the community when I came in. And it was while I was there, I lived there for 10 years. I came there to study with people like Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith, but also particularly I was working on my doctorate and was working under Stanislav Grof. Now, Stan Grof was the head, he was the leading psychiatrist in the world working with psychedelics, with sacred medicines, with LSD in particular. He had come from Prague, and at this point, he had just come from years working out of Johns Hopkins and the last surviving psychedelic therapy center research at that time. So during our years, during the decade that we were living and working at Esalen Institute at the same time, one of the problems that we had been trying to address was how do you, I think some of your listeners may be acquainted with this kind of paradox, which is that two people can take the exact same psychoactive substance, an entheogen like MDMA, or it could be a psychedelic, or it could be something like an ayahuasca journey. Same substance, same amount of dosage, and yet have a radically different experience. Really different, like heaven and hell kind of difference. And or the same person at different times could have radically different experiences, even though they're in the same setting, they have the same substance and dose. So therapists and researchers in this area, all during the 50s and 60s, had been trying to figure out, use different psychological tests to see whether they could predict how a person would respond, because these are powerful medicines, and there was no, it would be helpful to know whether people would be more likely to work well with it, or to what kind of experience they would have. But none of the standard tests, like the Rorschach test or the thematic apperception test, MMPI, none of them had any predictive value. They just didn't seem to help at all. And one day, an artist was in one of our seminars who also knew astrology well. And he told Stan and me that in his experience, people's transits, that is where the planets were in the sky relative to where they are in a person's birth chart, as I'm sure all your listeners know, but that was new to us at that time, that the transits were the best indication for what kinds of what qualities of experience a person might be going through at that time. And so he suggested that we learn how to calculate birth charts and learn how to calculate transits. And he showed us how. At this time, there was no personal computers and stuff, so we were doing it all by hand. And then because we had good records of our own sessions, and we also had Stan's database from over the years, we were able to see that the way astrologers described the meanings of certain transits, what the meanings of the planets were, and also their natal aspects, we were able to see that the kinds of experience that each person was having and the timing of those experiences matched up with uncanny consistency with the descriptions, that the descriptions of the transits, also the descriptions of the natal aspects correlated well with with certain consistent themes that a person would have over many years of doing this work. So we were astonished. We started doing more systematic research. Esalen was such a great laboratory of people going through transformational experiences because they went there for those kinds of experiences. And were taking workshops and seminars that involved practices like Gestalt therapy or Reichian work or different types of body work, somatic therapy, and so forth, where you'd go through deep transformations, and people just started lining up to get their chart and transits read, and we were watching the correlations unfold, and it just started teaching us a lot about how it worked. I was going to make what's already been perhaps too long of a story shorter at this point. I'll just summarize that. After that, I started looking at, well, what did Freud have when he kind of had his breakthrough into understanding the nature of the unconscious, and that dreams speak to us symbolically, or what transits did Rosa Parks have when she didn't get up from the bus and catalyzed the civil rights movement in 1955, or what did Galileo have when he turned the telescope to the heavens for the first time and saw, the kind of the much larger and different universe than he had been educated to think existed. So to see these kinds of breakthroughs, see how those transits also matched up with people who had breakthroughs in their psychological and spiritual journeys, also the crises, also how crises and breakthroughs tend to work together too. All these things started unfolding. And then finally, the last step was to start looking at what we called world transits, which traditionally is called mundane astrology, as you know, and to see, well, what happens when the entire world is going through these long-term outer planet transits, like the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that we have just been coming out of, or the Saturn square Uranus that we're in right now, or the long Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 60s, or the square that we had during the last decade, and to just see how consistent those across the world, when any given two outer planets or more outer planets come into alignment, major aspects in particular, and the conjunctions and oppositions and squares being the most dynamically visible in the cultural sphere. We just see across the world historical events and collective movements, cultural trends, and so forth, that remarkably reflect the exact nature of those particular planetary archetypes as they come together when you synthesize the meanings of, say, Saturn and Pluto, or Uranus and Neptune, For example, a huge generation was born under this recent Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the recent, in terms of centuries, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the later 20th century. And that whole generation has certain characteristics, the millennials basically, that very much reflect the nature of the Uranus-Neptune archetypal energies. And we see it being played out in many things, including, I think, the much greater openness to astrology, by the way, that I think we see in that generation. So that's a survey. You asked me perhaps a question that took longer to answer than
No,
would be
I
ideal.
asked for an origin story. So you actually, you cannot, an origin story requires that depth. And to me, I'm really stunned by this case study, because I don't think that I mean, this is the most compelling evidence of the efficacy of astrology that could potentially exist to me, you know, of seeing an internal experience reflected through the transits. And I think that has always been the dissonance for many people of understanding the way that a natal chart or transits are embodied, is that a lot of it does come from a psychological, internal, emotional, spiritual space. And these archetypes and these experiences aren't necessarily going to be, you know, a traditional scientific method isn't always going to be the best. Those aren't necessarily the best tools to be able to gauge the efficacy of it, even though it sounds like you were abiding by many of the same systems and techniques in this.
Except for the fact that we are always paying attention to the qualitative and not just the quantitative. In other words, it's the nature of this kind of research one needs to really dive deep into the qualities of experience that people are going through. And these can't always be quantified. They can be described in eloquent language, or they can be sometimes also they can be nonverbal. I mean, they can be experiences that are like a spiritual epiphany or something that's very somatic and doesn't really have a verbal content. And what you're putting your finger on, I think that's so important, is that the way astrology seems to work in terms of the expression of the meanings that are inherent in these planetary archetypal powers, what would be called the gods and goddesses in another era, and but in the modern period might be called more like psychological forces or complexes, as long as we use that word complex to mean not just pathology, but also all the positive things that can come from any archetypal energies coming through. To recognize that these are coming through in the inner world just as much as the outer world, and that the inner world is an arena that is just as vividly expressive of reality as the outer world. In fact, we're always seeing the outer world through our inner world. Every act of perception or claim of knowledge is an interpretation that is shaped by our psychology. It's shaped by our past. It's shaped by all sorts of things: gender, race, the historical era we're living in, the culture that we live in, and so forth. All these things are always shaping our experience, and these in turn shape how we view events, and also what kinds of events we draw towards us. That's important too. One of the great points that Jung makes in his work is how we draw towards us events, and sometimes disruptive events that reflect what we're not looking at inside. in other words, what does he say? Something like, what we keep in the unconscious comes back to us as if it's fate, as if it's just something happening to us without our volition. But in some ways, it's being constellated by our own psyche. As long as we recognize that we're not, each of us, separated from the whole, but we're, maybe this is a good point in our conversation to say that I believe that the way astrology works isn't so much that there is a like a electromagnetic or physical sort of force field that is making us be certain ways, like Mars is just making this person be angry or something like that in a kind of physiological way, like if Mars gets to this place and then it just has this linear causal effect. It's not like that. It more seems to be a synchronistic relationship between the movements of the planets and the movements of the archetypal energies within us and around us. And I love the ancient philosopher Plotinus's description of the reason for this correlation between the movements of the planets and the stars in the heavens and our own experiences here is that everything breathes together. Everything is interconnected. We're a larger unity. And as he also put it, everything is full of signs if you know how to read them. And the planets and sun and moon seem to be especially vivid vessels of intelligence and communication to us of the dynamics of the soul of the world, as it were, the anima mundi, we call it in philosophy and depth psychology, anima mundi, the soul of the world.
Yeah, I abide by that philosophy as well. I don't, I think when a lot of people find themselves in that, going beyond the horoscope, getting into the birth chart, seeing yourself reflected through these symbols and archetypes, through the location and the proximity of these different planets and in the way that they all coexist together. I think that then the next step for many of us becomes sort of an existential, but how could this possibly, how could this be? For me, discovering my Pisces moon, discovering my 8th house stellium, these were things that were groundbreaking realizations. Discovering my 12th house stellium, these were profound breakthroughs for me in my own personhood. And then how could that possibly be?
Exactly.
And it is this, and I think that any person who's really working with this material and is also applying critical thinking, an awareness of the limitations of symbols and archetypes, and the knowledge that these are the planets themselves did not speak and say, I'm the god, please name me after the god of war, or please, I would like to be Kronos, I would like to be time, I'm Saturn. The planets weren't asking for this. We were projecting our own truth onto the rotation of these celestial bodies. But what I find extraordinarily compelling is the fact that there was a correlation in time and in experience that was perfectly reflected in the time and experience that we have observing the planetary bodies from our perspective on Earth. And that vantage in this microcosm, macrocosm allows us to be able to turn telescopes into microscopes and microscopes into telescopes. And we can see the same timing and the same storyline unfold internally on Earth within us, but then also, on these greater outer planet experiences too, as it relates to, you know, the social planets, the transpersonal planets, however you want to call them, like greater cultural consciousness at large. And I also think that, you know, and the reason I love working with the outer planets is because even the discovery of these outer planets so perfectly captured the zeitgeist of each time that they were being discovered. You know, Neptune was imagined before it was even identified through a telescope. And like that, the beautiful correspondence between even the scientists and the astronomers who were identifying these different celestial bodies, we needed those celestial bodies to reflect massive changes that were happening socially at the time of their discovery. So to me, that just strengthens the idea that like we need a language that exists outside of ourselves to be able to reflect it back to ourselves.
That's true. And I think in that sense, the universe is kind of, it's given us a gift. It's a kind of ongoing gift of that would help us with our self-knowledge, our self-reflection, our self-understanding, and also remind us of our unity with the whole universe, and that we're not just these isolated skin encapsulated egos, as Alan Watts described it, that are isolated from a soulless, meaningless cosmos. Rather, the human soul and our spiritual and emotional lives and moral lives are embedded in a universe that also is capable of carrying meanings and purposes, and the fact that there is this ongoing, scarcely believable orchestration of the movements of the planets with our experience suggests a very powerful intelligence is at work here, far beyond anything that we human beings could really imagine. You've put your finger on an important distinction between like the planets that were known to the ancients because they're visible to the naked eye, which would be besides the sun and moon, but the planets Mercury through Saturn, all of which were visible to the ancients, while Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the planets discovered in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, respectively, those were they did not come, excuse me, they did not come with a pre-given significance. The astronomers they had different reasons for coming up with those names, which each one has its own little history. For example, Uranus was originally called in Latin George's star, Georgium Sidus, because the discoverer, William Herschel, wanted to honor his sovereign patron, in the King of England, George. And so, but of course, the French astronomers were not enthusiastic about having a new planet named after a British king. And so there was a number of discussions about what would be the right name. And then it was finally named Uranus, because Uranus is the father of Saturn, Kronos, who's the father of Jupiter, Zeus, who's the father of Mars and Venus and Mercury. Okay, so and then Neptune and Pluto each have their backgrounds to the naming. Now, you mentioned that the planet Saturn or the planet Mars didn't say to us, I want to be named this or that, but rather we, did you say project our inner meanings onto the planets in some sense? If we follow what the ancients describe as much as we can, what their own experience was like, and of course we're getting back to periods before often before their adequate written records, so we have to piece together a lot. But it does seem that there was a kind of capacity for, let's just call it a capacity for intuition. Sometimes it's been called a kind of natural clairvoyance that the ancients had, indigenous people, capacity to kind of read nature and perceive the heavens with, in some sense, a range of vision and understanding that our later modern consciousness may not always have access to. And there may have been, and in fact, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when the Mesopotamians were, and then later the Greeks were naming the planets, as Plato put it, the planet that is sacred to Kronos, or the planet that is sacred to Hermes or to Aphrodite, that they were doing so with a sense that while the planet may not have just said, name me Mars or something like that, or Aries or Aphrodite, in some sense there was a discernment, not just a projection, but a discernment by the human students of the heavens, the astrologers. It was one science at that point, and they were recognizing these meanings, and then these meanings get passed on, and of course they develop as our own consciousness develops. We get a deeper and deeper sense of their nature, their meanings, even right up to the present. But then the outer planets start being discovered by telescope, and that creates a whole nother issue, because we didn't inherit these traditional meanings, and who's to say that the astronomers, who often were not astrologers, I mean, generally they weren't in the modern period, and they're naming them for different reasons. Like Pluto is named Pluto because kind of combination of factors. PL for Pluto also happens to be Percival Lowell, the first letters of his name, the person who initiated the search for Pluto, the astronomer. Also, there was a young girl, I think she was 11 years old, who was, I think, the granddaughter of one of the astronomers who was on the committee to make the decision. And she knew Greek mythology, and she made a very strong case for Pluto as being appropriate. And those kind of combined, I've heard that there is also she had some fondness for the Disney character of that name as well. It was 1930. But the gist of it is that different factors went into the naming of these planets. And it was only over time that the astrologers, studying carefully, well, what happens when a person is born with that planet rising? Or what happens when a person goes through a transit with Pluto conjoining their sun, or Uranus opposing their Venus? What do we see happening during that period? And they start seeing patterns and qualities that repeat themselves, often relating quite interestingly to the original astronomers' names, though with some variation, which is beyond our time right now to discuss. So and I think you're completely right that the discovery of a planet in the modern period tended to coincide with a period in which the archetypal qualities of that period were especially in evidence in the collective psyche. So Uranus and the wave of revolutionary energies, American Revolution, French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, Romanticism, and so forth, that were all, it was coming up to the surface at that time. Or Pluto in 1930. I mean, you look at that period, that kind of decade or more on each side of that period, just how much the world descended into a plutonic crucible of often, like a volcanic transformation, but with all the many challenging qualities of Pluto at work. And Neptune, the middle of the 19th century, the spread of Asian mystical traditions into the West, the founding of the chemical industry and anesthetics, the wave of romanticism and what was in the U.S. the version of it was called transcendentalism with people like Emerson and Margaret Fuller and so forth.
The advent of photography, which I just think is remarkable.
Very true. A perfect example of it. So these everything's breathing together, and just as when we're born, we are carrying a kind of imprint of the state of the cosmic archetypal dynamics at that point, as reflected in the positions of the planets at the time and place that we're born. In the same way, when a planet or a new celestial body is discovered, in some sense, it too is bearing the qualities that we see at work in the collective psyche and history at that point. Now, a lot of research needs to be done on the new bodies that are being discovered almost as we speak over these last couple of decades. It takes a lot of careful research and reflection, but we're at that point now where there's universal consensus about the meanings of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in the astrological community around the world. Of anybody that studies and uses those planets, there's no big controversy about what the meanings of those planets are. Now, that's pretty amazing. If astrology is just an illusion, how do you get thousands and thousands of astrologers who to agree that they are seeing the same thing when they are notoriously like cats in terms of herding them into a single line of thought? It's a very diverse community, but there's no real disagreement about what those meanings are. And that's because they're so consistent, and because there's been a lot of research over the last century and over a century and a half with Uranus, Neptune, about that, and Pluto now for 90 years.
Yeah, I think that the Pluto, I have this wonderful, I love collecting, I love going to used bookstores and collecting old astrology books.
Good
and
for
I have
you.
Thank you. It's one of the reasons I have so many books around and not know where of being able to inventory them. But I have this wonderful copy of it's called A to Z Horoscopic Delineation by Llewellyn. And it's from the first edition was 1914. And the edition that I have was just within the first decade of Pluto being discovered. And the language around it is so, it's so beautiful, because it is that perfect balance of, we're going to try to work with this narrative. We're going to see if Pluto as representing, the underworld, representing this concept of Hades, representing this sort of like, this depth of character of person. We're going to see if it checks out. Like we'll give it a good college try, but we don't know yet. And the edition that I have brings Pluto in as a revised edition of the material, in recognizing that something really important, obviously, Planet 9 was discovered. And in the discovery of this, from an astrological perspective, we need time to see if these associations, if these archetypes are going to fit the bill. Yeah. And I love, it's so wonderful to have this as sort of like this portal back into astrologers from almost a century ago to see how they were trying to, is it working? Is it going to work? We hope it works, but it might not work. And in which case, all of this might end up being useless and throw it out. And it's interesting to be in, obviously, since then through now, technology, space travel, our ability to see and discover new things in our solar system and then way beyond our solar system has just increased exponentially at rates that I'm not even sure if we have enough deities to be able to assign these characters to. And it's an interesting time to still be present, it's an interesting time to watch the integration of that. I'm really closely following the James Webb Telescope. I think I'm so grateful to be alive in this moment in history, because no doubt we are going to unearth unbelievable things with this, just as we did with the Hubble telescope. It's tremendous what we see. And then to marry that with astrology is both like very daunting and then also really exciting. And perhaps that is also, that's Uranus at work right now, giving us access into, maybe that's the squares, maybe that's giving us access into our ability to really stretch our understanding of what astrology can do and create maybe some boundaries of what it doesn't do, to be able to define its shape as it relates to space itself.
Yeah, that Uranus, with the whole Hubble telescope phenomenon, that very much was an expression of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction when it was launched, and then it had to be corrected a little bit afterwards as Jupiter came into the alignment with it. And and from that point on, after they corrected the mirror, it just all through the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the 90s, we were just getting flooded with images that were expanding through technology, Uranus, but they're images, which is Neptune, and there's even that quality of numinous wonder that comes with seeing those kinds of photographs and images is very reflective of the Uranus-Neptune. By the way, it's so important to acknowledge our ancestors and our debts. And the person who first really recognized this phenomenon that you talked about, namely that the discovery of the outer planets coincided with periods that had the qualities of that planet at play in the collective in the world history and the cultural life of that time over a decade, not just like right that day or that year, but over a several year or even a decade or two on each side of this larger orb, as it were. And it was Dane Rudhyar who recognized that, and it was in a book that was originally published as The Sun is Also a Star. That was the original title. And I think it's also been published later under the title Birth Patterns of a New Humanity. And he nails it, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, with talking about the major phenomena, the revolutionaries of the 18th century and the discovery of Uranus, the kind of spiritualism. In fact, spiritualism and the mediums and the people who were tapping into the spiritual world in new ways, starting with the Fox sisters in upstate New York, 1848. That's all coinciding with Neptune, and then Pluto, of course, in the 20th century. So it's really Dane Rudhyar that we owe a lot to for his. I mean, we owe a lot to for many reasons. He was probably the major 20th century astrologer who did the great integration that Jung pointed to of the findings of astronomy and the astrological tradition with the findings of depth psychology coming out of Freud and Jung and the archetypal psychology and so forth, and how these really marry in the most fruitful way, including the very important point that by being more psychologically aware of what planetary principles are at work in our particular life, at what time, and also the enduring patterns that are suggested by our natal chart. The more self-knowledge we have of that sort, it gives us a capacity to act more freely, more consciously, more skillfully. Astrology then is not telling us what our predestined fate is and that we're then somehow imprisoned in it because that's what our chart says. That's I think a real misreading of the potential for astrology and the beauty of what Dane Rudhyar in particular. I mean, he was drawing on others, but he was the key spokesperson for recognizing how much these are multivalent symbols that can work out in a wide range of ways that can be very life enhancing, or they can be shadow forms of the same archetypal complex. And it's up to us, not up to the heavens, as to how we respond to those energies.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I also was just recalling and I think that it's important to remind listeners, even though this is obviously in the background, just as a byproduct of the material, but the psychological, the real integration of psychology in the late 19th century into the early 20th century was so cataclysmic in understanding how the nuances of the internal world and in the internal experience. And of course, I say this thing called tank, which means there are no coincidences. Pluto becomes assigned to that very nature, just, on the tail end of that, as it was really going on. But I always remember when I was in high school, learning about Chekhov and the Chekhov plays and how radically different they were in tone, in nature, in narrative from anything that had really come before. And a big part of that was because it coincided with psychology. And prior to that, we had these dramatics. It's very entertaining. It's very external. And then playwrights such as Chekhov are turning the gaze inward and really bringing the story about the human experience on an individual level. And that is so punctuated with Pluto, that changes our entire framing of these planets and the way that we embody them individually. And then, of course, we are, I don't want to say coming out of the United States Pluto return, we're still very much within it. As we are here in the United States Pluto return, we are talking about Pluto. We're talking about the soul, the depth, the psychological undercurrent of a nation, and trying to, and all of us are, watching what's happening. Obviously, right in the same week of the exact United States Pluto return, we have Russia invading Ukraine. I feel like that is, the correlation that I see in that is it's very Plutonian. To me, it feels already very Plutonian of looking at the United States' own movements as a nation, and how, the storyline of the United States of the not terribly distant past, not looking that radically different from the tyranny of Russia invading a sovereign nation. To me, that is the mirror so far that I see. but obviously time will tell how this all unfolds. But that is striking a chord in thinking about the origins of the United States itself as well.
If you think in terms of, I think one of the characteristics of the Pluto return is certainly the United States need to look at its shadow, and in terms of the timing of the Pluto return, we have to, as you were saying, it's not just that day or a short period. I mean, the Pluto return is a big epoch. And if you think about your Saturn return, or anybody's Saturn return, the first or the second, sometimes the third, but everybody who's an astrologer or is astrologically initiated has some sense of the importance of that first Saturn return in bringing a kind of maturational threshold that moves one from one's youth into one's mature years of whether it's in terms of one's work in the world, one's calling, one's relationships, one's commitments, many factors that go into that Saturn return, including our encounter with our own mortality, but a greater potential for being our own parent rather than being dependent on even unconsciously on older authorities to tell us what to do. There's much more. If a well-integrated Saturn return involves kind of introjecting those authority figures so that you become your own authority in a certain way. Now, when we think of the Saturn return, it's clearly not something that happens in a day. And in fact, there's pretty wide consensus that from around age 28 to 30 is a pretty full-on Saturn return, probably from, approximately from the 28th birthday right through age 30, so say the 3 years up until the 31st birthday. Is when it's most active. And I've, like in Cosmos and Psyche, I list about, 50 examples of famous people at what happened to them during their Saturn return and how pivotal it was in their lives. Now, the reason I bring that up is, well, if the Saturn return is approximately 3 years, then a Pluto return for a country, obviously individuals don't get Pluto returns because we don't live to be 250 years old or 48. So in this case, we've been going through the Pluto return for a while, in my view, and it's going to be unfolding for a while. We're certainly at an epicenter of it, and the Pluto return is suggests that the entire country will be and has been going through a great crucible of transformation that involves a kind of descent, a descent into the underworld, a descent into needing to face our shadow. I think many the political upheavals that we've had to see in the last 5 years in particular, 5-6 years, the upsurge in things like racism, for example, and seeing the consequences of it and becoming conscious of the history of the United States in a way that hasn't been focused on in our high school textbooks, where it's kind of a different story is given than what good historians have been and are now, with increasing clarity, revealing from the research as to what our nation's history actually has been. As noble an experiment as the United States project is, it's one that is as fallible and imbued with cruelty and self-deception as the history of any other nation, just because it's a human phenomenon. And in addition, becoming conscious of that is the only way to go through that kind of plutonic transformation that moves from a dying to an old identity to a rebirth, and to the possibility of a kind of cleansing and that comes from that deep self-confrontation. But looking at power struggles and experiencing power struggles, dealing with collapse of structures and seeing the need for a kind of redemptive transformation in our national psyche. I think those are all very characteristic of the Pluto return. I'm cautiously hopeful that as this decade progresses of the 2020s, and we're moving into a Uranus trine Pluto in the course of this decade, be getting tighter and tighter as we move to 2024, 25, et cetera. And not only will the Pluto return be happening, but the US is going to go through a Uranus return.
I know. It's wild. It's wild.
So they're both moving into position where they were when 1776 happened. And the difference is that Uranus, this will be the third Uranus return. The first one was right at the time of the Civil War and the birth of, as Lincoln called it, a new birth of freedom that would, in a sense, help fulfill the potential of the original birth of freedom that didn't include everybody.
Right.
And
selective freedom.
Very patriarchal, racial, and other propertied privilege and so forth that that affected the citizens' power. So we're in a continuing moral journey as a country, and this Pluto return I see as signifying a very significant threshold of transformation for us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that I feel that with the Russian movement into Ukraine, I think that what we will see, or what I anticipate on a collective level us experiencing, is continued reckoning in the United States of how do we differentiate one manifest destiny promise from another.
Good point. Mm-hmm.
And I hope that Putin and Russia and this storyline does not look so similar to how the United States and the impact that the United States in forming itself has been. But I do think that it is impossible not to, ask ourselves on this collective level, like, why was it okay when we did it, but it's not okay if he does it? You know what I mean? Like, it's a reckoning. It's an awareness of our own fallacies as a nation, and how you can't make exceptions, or what are exceptions in the year 2022? How have things changed? And if we are making exceptions now, if things have changed, what is the United States doing to differentiate itself from its own past?
Very good point, indeed. And I think it's important too to remember that when we're thinking of Russia, Russia's got a profound spiritual depth to its people and its culture. You brought up Chekhov, who was an extraordinary voice of the Russian soul, who transformed 20th century theater in doing so. Also, short stories are fantastic too. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, the great Russian poets like Anna Akhmatova and others. Well, they we have to remember that the Russian people, right to this moment, they don't know what's going on as a people, what's going on in Ukraine, because the propaganda and the suppression of even calling it a war. They don't know that they don't know the soldiers are dying. Any dissidents are being arrested and punished, etc. So what we're looking at is a will to power, above all on the part of Putin. And it's going to be important for us Americans to make distinctions and remember that the entire, not to demonize the entire Russian people, who are in many respects they're not aware of what's happening. And in addition, if there had been fair and free elections, it's quite questionable whether Putin would be their leader. So, and we know a little bit about that in our own country. So, yeah, I think you're right on target in terms of recognizing even the events that are happening internationally outside of our country's borders have meaning for our own transits and our own self-understanding and our own moral growth as a nation.
Yeah, we have to see what happens. So I have two questions for you, which I conclude every episode with. The first is, what do you believe in? Casual. A casual existential question. This is why, if you need to say chicken sandwich, we accept a chicken sandwich answer.
I have a belief in that overlaps with a sense of awareness of. I remember when Jung was asked towards the end of his life, did he believe in God? And he hesitated for a second as he answered the interviewer. I think it was a BBC interview. And at first he said, no, not believe, I know. And he had, in other words, he had a kind of direct experience of what of a divine dimension of being. And to say, I believe in it can sometimes mean, well, this is kind of a leap, or I'm taking others' word on it, or this is what I was taught and therefore I believe it, etc. But if we take the word belief to also include the idea that I live on the basis of a conviction and a continuing lived experience that we live in an intelligent cosmos that is a profound mystery that's unfolding, and that we human beings are participating in that mystery, and we seem to have a particular role to play because of our capacities for self-reflection, also our capacities for destruction, and what that can, how many other species on this earth we can affect by our actions or inaction, our blindness. And so there is, for me, the bringing your question home to the question of astrology and the background for our whole conversation here. I think the fact that the universe is providing us as human beings with a continuing disclosure or revelation of how the universe itself is seems to be meaningfully focused on this earth, this moving earth, no doubt not just on this earth, but from those of us who live on this earth, it is clear these correlations are showing us that the movements of the planets and of the earth and the continuing alignments are constantly in this kind of beautiful orchestrated harmony with our own experiences and the dramas of history and so forth. And to recognize that this, for us to see that we have been given the possibility of recognizing our connection to the universe itself is a sign that the universe in some sense is pouring its capacities for meaning towards this earth and towards each of us on it. It's an act of caring in a certain way. And in that respect, we are the recipients of a kind of cosmic love, as well as the recipients of and the carriers of a certain responsibility in relationship to this very special role that we have to be able to discern the symbolic meanings and to be able to track them with our telescopes and to study them with our psychological meaning and our understanding and our historical research and so forth. All this is, I believe in such a universe, and I'm convinced that we exist in it, and it's a blessing. It provides a sense of existential and spiritual grounding and centering, a kind of security. Not that any of us can't be quite destabilized in a moment by the unpredictable events of our lives. But beyond that, I believe we're being carried by a larger benevolent whole that is intelligent and is aware of not only this earth as what it is, but also the fact that each of us as individuals and our individual birth charts have significance. And the moment-to-moment transits that we're going through, that those are also correlated with the planets. It just suggests that in some sense, the divine intelligence is just pouring out its meaning every moment to every individual and to our entire Earth community. And no doubt it's doing it to the rest of the universe as well. So that's kind of an awesome reality to me to be dealing with. And I think it's something that astrologers are in the uniquely privileged position to be able to experience directly for themselves.
I love it. That's when you started talking about this cosmic love, I was thinking about Cosmos and Eros and Psyche, adding Eros into the title mix as well.
I actually gave many years ago, like 30 years ago, I gave a lecture on Cosmos and Eros. Yeah,
I love it.
In Berkeley.
Question number 2 is, how does magic show up in your life?
Well, I suppose what I've just been describing is a kind of magic. If we think of magic as being, there's many ways to define it, but let me just think of it as representing, reflecting the possibility that we live in an enchanted universe. What are the signs of that? Well, the signs of it are things like synchronicities that happen to us, where we meet that person or hear that talk or read that book right at the time that, in retrospect, we couldn't imagine our lives unfolding the way it should have, the way they should have, unless that person had come into our lives at that time, or unless we had come across that idea, or this book almost like opened up to that page, and I got that insight that moves me in this direction rather than that. Those kinds of synchronicities, which sometimes can be quite compelling and give you the sense that, wow, more is going on here than random accidents, that I'm not just projecting my meaning onto it. it is telling me to pay attention, that this is meaningful. And I've had plenty of those kinds of experiences. So that's one form. I suppose, Gary Snyder is a poet he was one of the Beats and became one of the great poets of the ecological awareness of the last half century. And he, in a talk he was giving to writers, or about how to be a writer, or how to cultivate the capacity as maybe as a poet or a writer generally. I remember he talked about the importance of reading and writing and mastering your craft as much as possible. And then he adds, and know at least 2 forms of magic. And I thought, well, what are my 2 forms of magic, which immediately came to mind? I mean, and one is definitely astrology, and which is a kind of sacred practice that kind of allows an unprecedented insight into the interior workings of the universe and of human life. It illuminates so much. It's quite magical as well as profound. And then for me also, the sacred medicines, the journey I've had since the 1960s has certainly been one that has been blessed by, as well as challenged by, my work with the different psychedelics, as well as cannabis and so forth, which I think, if used in a very disciplined, reverential, careful way, can play an extraordinary role in our transformation, our healing, and our deeper insight into things. But
and an
needs to be taken.
undeniable Pisces through and through. And I wanted to ask you as well how the Jupiter transit has been for you.
Well, it went across my sun, I suppose, right as both a book that I had been editing in honor of Stan Groff. I've been co-editing, called Psyche Unbound, right as that came out in January. And then this 10-part documentary series called Changing of the Gods was just released this past month, right during my birthday week, and it went out to, I don't know, like 100,000 people during its first launch. It'll have successive launches to come. I didn't make the series, but it's based on my work. A team of filmmakers made it. The head of Pioneers was the person who gathered a team of filmmakers and made this 10-part series about basically history and the planetary movements and all the great social, ecological justice movements and women's movements, so forth, scientific revolutions that have correlated with the planetary alignments that I set out in Cosmos and Psyche. So when that has gone out and been seen by so many people, I got that typical Jupiter Sun thing of suddenly the sun is shining on you a lot, perhaps more than I can, more than I relish, because I'm a little bit of a, I like my seclusion. But anyway, and the email box tends to get much too full for me to be able to keep up with, which, as a dedicated attempting to be responsible and responsive person, is very hard to, when you can't keep up, no matter how hard you try.
That's true. That's very, very true. In the spirit of sign symbols and synchronicities, I usually pull a card with a question in mind, but I think it might be fun to just pull a card. These are all the astrology symbols, and to see what that tells us. Does that sound good to you?
Sure. Well,
unless you have a specific unless there is an entry point that you would like to come into it with.
Oh no, I'm fine with letting it speak to us.
Cool. here's our human intervention though. Would you like me to pull from pile 1, 2, or 3?
Oh, well, let's go with pile 2.
Great choice. Love pile 2. Okay, here we are. We pulled the Grand Cross, and the term that they have here is provoker. So what are your thoughts on the Grand Cross?
The Grand Cross, of course, astrologically is the most dynamic and the most challenging of alignments. And what comes to mind is the fact that, I mean, in some sense, the world, I mean, we've been discussing a world in crisis, and we're all participating in it. And I think the more we engage it with open heart and open eyes, the more we experience the challenges and sufferings of the world. But the thing about the Grand Cross is that, in fact, this is something that came only slowly to me as I studied more and more people's charts, famous individuals' charts, and historical periods as well. And that is that, you know, we're sometimes taught, you know, all this, especially in the earlier astrological textbook, they would talk about like an evil aspect or a good aspect, and really kind of a very dualistic view of good and bad, or you're born under a bad sign, or this relationship will never work out because you've got squares between your this and that. And I think that's a real misreading of astrology. And when we and the proof of that is that if you study carefully the people whom you most admire, and what you most admire about them, and then you look at their charts, it's typically the hard aspects, the squares, the oppositions, conjunctions, that carry the very qualities that you most admire in that person. And it's also when those individuals are undergoing hard aspect transits, such as the Grand Cross, that they are challenged to meet. I mean, that's where the true heroic journey takes place, and the heroic courage and effort to be able to take a situation like that. And those Grand Crosses make things happen. The forces are coming from all these kind of opposing directions, and we need to become the crucible that synthesizes, integrates, honors all four directions in some sense. It's a mandala, and we need to be in the center and somehow be able to take it and integrate it. And that in some sense is a crucifixion. At another level, it's a birth. And so that's how I would look at that Grand Cross, knowing that we're in a very challenging time, and that is a kind of symbol of it as well. But where there are challenges, that's where the great moments of that we most admire, that we find most admirable, that we feel, now that person lived their life in a noble way, a way that I aspire to. Those things didn't usually happen with the person who just had all trines and no squares or oppositions, or their lives were, I mean, everybody goes through hard aspect transits, but it's the hard aspect transits that tend to coincide with the periods in a person's life that really shows us who they are, and right, reflects their greatness as a person.
Yeah, it's a character defining moment to have all those cardinal directions activated. I'll take a grand cross over a grand trine any day, any day, any day. It's too, if you haven't been able to tell yet, I'm a Capricorn rising. When I have the Uranus, Neptune, I have Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn all in Capricorn on my ascendant. So for me, a grand cross is a homecoming. I love the tension. I love the dialogue. I love the different points of view, and I love the integration. I love that we have to find a way to make it work, coming from all of these different angles. All of the squares meeting together in this formation is action, it's momentum, it's a choice. And I think that I love that we pulled this card for our conversation. I think that totally fits the bill. It totally tracks. So,
and
Dr.
it's also fiery. You can see the coloring on it, at least as I can see it here. It's got a kind of Plutonic crucible to it as well.
It does, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it brings us into sacred geometry. It brings us into these greater cross-cultural truths that exist in so many esoteric and mystical traditions that extend beyond the Western mythology and the Western archetypes. The shapes in here are these universally understood geometries and points that are found in all organic matter.
Yeah, it's the mandala, which is a great sacred symbol where you have the square and the circle, which is kind of bringing together time and eternity and all the other opposites in a larger conjunctio, a conjunctio positorum, or conjunctio complexio oppositorum. It's a unity of above and below, left and right, and masculine, feminine, conscious, unconscious. All those things are coming together in that Grand Cross symbol of the mandala.
I love it. So where can our listeners find you and find your work, and also find this new show that came out?
Okay, so I'm going to have to, I do have a website that I need to update. I've been so focused on, one of the things that when you're a professor is that you're so busy with your students and with preparing lectures and so forth, it's hard to keep up with keeping one's website up to date. But there are certainly, if you go to cosmosandspsyche.com, there's good essays that I've written there, some interviews. You can also simply Google Richard Tarnas, and there's quite a few of my lectures that are just around right now, or interviews, podcasts, etc. You mentioned the one with Chris Brennan that I did a few weeks ago, that and that was focused particularly on Pluto, but it went to many topics in the course of the long period he interviewed me. And then so yeah, you could look there. For those of you who are readers, Cosmos and Psyche is worth reading. The book itself. Passion of the Western Mind is a work that my earlier work, which is not astrological explicitly, although astrology plays a role in the history of the Western worldview that I'm tracing, but it in some ways prepares us for understanding astrology, because and the role of astrology today, because I'm tracking how our understanding of the universe evolved over the last 2,500 years, and how our understanding of archetypes, for example, which is a term from Plato, the Platonic tradition, but is also connected to the ancient experience of the gods and goddesses, and to the modern psychological view of archetypes as powerful psychological forces and forms, principles in our own soul. So those two books you might find worthwhile as well. Those interested in the work and Stan Groff that I've worked a lot with. That new anthology of essays is called Psyche Unbound. A lot of great essays in there by about 20 different scholars. I mentioned Joseph Campbell's one of them, Fritjof Capra, Francis Vaughan. It's a lot of great essays there. And then finally, the film series, which is right now, I mean, actually, the people who made the film, the documentary, are right now deciding what's the next way it will be released. It went through this 3-week period where people could watch it for free, one a day, and then many people, or you could buy the whole series. Now, that was done by a particular distributor, and that's over right now. And so they're planning out, whether they're going to put it on something like Netflix or one of the major places where you can stream such a documentary, or some other way. I imagine word will get around the astrological community when that release plan is disseminated. But I will do my best to make sure that that's on my website, cosmosandspsyche.com, when we do know what's happening.
Amazing. Thank you so very much for this beautiful conversation, for your time, for your knowledge. I so deeply appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm grateful for your invitation, and yeah, now that I've heard you and experienced our conversation, I'm grateful for really appreciating your work in the world now that I have seen it in action.
Thank you so much.